In May 1942, British warships opened fire on a French colony. British Royal Marines stormed beaches defended by French soldiers. British aircraft strafed French positions, and by the time the guns fell silent, dozens of Frenchmen lay dead, killed not by the Nazis they were supposedly allied against, but by their own former ally, Great Britain. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't friendly fire. It was a deliberate, planned invasion. Britain's first major amphibious operation of the entire Second World War, launched a full 2 years before Normandy. And the target wasn't a Japanese-held island or a German-occupied port. It was Madagascar, a French colony off the coast of East Africa, controlled not by Germany, but by France itself, or rather by the collaborationist Vichy French government that had struck a deal with Hitler after France's defeat in 1940. This is the story of Operation Ironclad, the strange, largely forgotten campaign where Britain invaded a fellow Frenchman's territory to stop it from possibly, maybe, one day falling into Japanese hands. It's a story about paranoia, preemption, and the uncomfortable reality that, in total war, yesterday's ally can become tomorrow's target. And it reveals just how seriously the Allies took the nightmare scenario of a two-ocean Axis pincer that, in the end, never actually happened. Part 1. The Poisoned Inheritance of Vichy France. To understand why British ships were shelling a French colony in 1942, you first have to understand the strange, split personality of France itself after 1940. When Germany crushed French resistance in 6 weeks during the Battle of France, the French government did not entirely disappear. Instead, it split into two competing claims to legitimacy. In London, General Charles de Gaulle declared himself the leader of Free France, a government in exile determined to keep fighting alongside Britain. But inside France itself, the government that most French citizens, soldiers, and colonial administrators actually recognized was the one led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, operating out of the spa town of Vichy, which had signed an armistice with Germany and administered the unoccupied southern portion of the country, along with, crucially, France's entire overseas empire. This mattered enormously, because French colonial territories were not small strategic afterthoughts. French colonies stretched across North Africa, West Africa, the Middle East, Indochina, and the Indian Ocean, and the vast majority of colonial administrators, garrison commanders, and naval officers stayed loyal to Vichy rather than to de Gaulle. From Britain's perspective, this created a deeply unsettling situation. French territory across the globe, garrisoned by French troops with French warships, was now nominally under the control of a government that had made peace with Hitler and was, at least officially, neutral, but whose independence from German pressure could never be fully trusted. Britain had already seen how badly this could go. In July 1940, fearing the powerful French fleet at Mers el-Kabir in Algeria might fall into German hands, the Royal Navy had attacked and sunk much of it, killing around 1,300 French sailors in a matter of minutes. It was a brutal, controversial decision that poisoned Anglo-French relations for years. But it established the grim logic that would define Britain's approach to Vichy territory for the rest of the war. Better to strike first against a former ally than risk that ally's assets falling into German or, eventually, Japanese hands. Madagascar would become the next chapter in that same grim logic. Part 2. Why Madagascar? The Strategic Nightmare of 1942. By early 1942, the global war had transformed dramatically, and not in the Allies' favor. Japan had entered the war in December 1941, and its opening months were a catastrophe for Western colonial powers across Asia. Hong Kong fell, Malaya fell, Most devastatingly, Singapore, supposedly Britain's impregnable fortress in the east, surrendered in February 1942 in what Winston Churchill himself called the worst disaster in British military history. Burma was falling. The Dutch East Indies were falling. Japanese naval power seemed, for a terrifying stretch of months, almost unstoppable. And Japanese naval power was reaching further west than anyone had anticipated. In April 1942, a Japanese carrier task force under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same commander who had led the strike on Pearl Harbor, swept into the Indian Ocean and hit British naval bases at Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, sinking 2 British heavy cruisers and the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes. For a brief, alarming period, the Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet was forced to retreat all the way to East Africa, ceding the Indian Ocean to Japanese domination. This is the context that made Madagascar suddenly, urgently important. The island sits at a strategic choke point along the sea lanes connecting the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, controlling access to the Mozambique Channel, a route that Allied convoys depended on to move troops, oil, and supplies from the Middle East and India around the Cape of Good Hope, since the Mediterranean was largely closed to Allied shipping due to Axis control of much of North Africa. If Japan could establish a naval or submarine base at Madagascar's excellent natural harbor of Diego Suarez on the island's northern tip, Japanese submarines and surface raiders could potentially strangle this vital supply route, cutting off Allied forces fighting in North Africa and the Middle East from reinforcement. British intelligence had genuine reason for concern, even if, as later became clear, the actual likelihood of Japan mounting such an operation was lower than feared. There were reports, later found to be exaggerated but taken seriously at the time, that German or Japanese naval officers had approached Vichy authorities about basing rights, or that Vichy France might allow Japanese forces to use Madagascar, much as it had already allowed Japanese forces into French Indochina back in 1940 and 1941, a precedent that made the fear anything but paranoid fantasy. If Vichy administrators in Madagascar behaved the same way Vichy administrators in Indochina had, the island could become a Japanese forward base without a single shot being fired between Vichy and Tokyo. It's worth putting this in the context of just how dire Britain's overall strategic position looked in the spring of 1942. The Atlantic was hemorrhaging merchant shipping to German U-boats faster than British and American shipyards could replace it. The Mediterranean route to Egypt and the Middle East was effectively closed to convoys because of Axis air and naval power based in Italy, Sicily, and North Africa, forcing virtually all Allied shipping bound for the Middle East, India, and the Far East to take the long route around the Cape of Good Hope and up through the Mozambique Channel, precisely the waters a Japanese base at Madagascar could threaten. Losing that route, even temporarily, could have starved British forces in Egypt of the fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements they needed at almost exactly the moment Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps was pushing toward Cairo. Viewed against that backdrop, the decision to act preemptively against even a plausible rather than certain threat becomes considerably easier to understand. Churchill and British military planners decided they could not afford to wait and see. The decision was made. Britain would seize Madagascar before Japan ever got the chance to ask. Part 3. Planning Operation Ironclad. Codenamed Operation Ironclad, the plan that emerged called for a substantial amphibious assault, a genuinely significant undertaking for a Britain that was simultaneously fighting in North Africa, defending against the Blitz's aftermath, supplying the Soviet Union through Arctic convoys, and trying to hold together an empire that was cracking apart in Asia. A force assembled was larger than many people realized. Around 13,000 British and British Empire troops were committed to the operation, including Royal Marines and units drawn from British, South African, and East African forces. The naval component included the battleship HMS Ramillies, the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious, and a substantial escort of cruisers and destroyers, a formidable commitment of resources for what was, on paper, an operation against a fellow Allied nation's colonial garrison rather than the Axis powers themselves. The target was Diego Suarez, the excellent natural harbor at Madagascar's northern tip, which offered exactly the kind of deep-water anchorage that would make an ideal naval base for whoever controlled it. Taking Diego Suarez, planners believed, would deny Japan its potential prize without requiring Britain to conquer the entirety of Madagascar, an island roughly the size of France itself and far too large to garrison completely given Britain's already overstretched forces. There was also a deeper diplomatic sensitivity at play. Britain was extremely careful, obsessively so, to frame this operation not as a war against France, but as a necessary defensive action against Japanese ambitions, one that unfortunately required fighting the French garrison currently in place. British propaganda and instructions given to troops before the landing repeatedly emphasized that this was not a war against the French people, that Vichy forces would be treated correctly as prisoners rather than enemies once they surrendered, and that the operation was aimed at protecting Madagascar from Japan, not conquering it from France. Whether Vichy defenders, taking fire from British warships, saw much practical difference in that distinction is, of course, a separate question. Part 4. The landings at Diego Suarez. In the early hours of May 5, 1942, British forces began landing on the beaches near Diego Suarez, on the western side of the peninsula, deliberately avoiding the more heavily defended approaches directly facing the harbor itself. Royal Marine commandos led the initial assault, supported by naval gunfire and carrier-based aircraft from HMS Illustrious, which worked to suppress French coastal defenses and destroy the small Vichy naval and air assets stationed on the island before they could offer serious resistance. The Vichy French garrison, numbering several thousand troops, including a mix of French regulars, colonial troops, and Malagasy soldiers serving under French command, fought back with more determination than British planners had necessarily expected. This wasn't a token, symbolic resistance meant to satisfy honor before an inevitable surrender. French coastal batteries engaged British ships, and Vichy defenders contested the British advance inland with genuine, sustained combat over the following days. Fighting continued through the following days as British forces pushed to encircle and capture Diego Suarez itself. Casualties, while modest compared to the war's major battles, were real on both sides. Several dozen British and Empire troops killed, with French losses somewhat higher, alongside a number of civilian Malagasy casualties, caught in a conflict that was, from their perspective, entirely not theirs to have any stake in. By May 7th, just 2 days after the initial landings, the main French garrison at Diego Suarez surrendered, and British forces secured the crucial harbor that had been the entire point of the operation. Militarily, the primary objective had been achieved remarkably quickly and with relatively modest cost, particularly by the standards of the WWII war. But then, something unexpected happened. The war didn't actually end there. Part 5. The Forgotten Second Phase. Conquering the rest of the island. Here's the part of this story that gets skipped over almost entirely. Diego Suarez had fallen in early May, but Madagascar as a whole, its capital at Tananarive, modern Antananarivo, and the vast majority of the island's territory and Vichy colonial administration remained under French control for months afterward. British planners initially hoped that capturing the strategically vital harbor would be enough, and that Vichy administrators governing the rest of the island might simply accept the new reality without further bloodshed. This did not happen. The Vichy Governor-General of Madagascar, Armand Léon Annette, refused to surrender the rest of the colony, and a strange, low-intensity standoff developed through the summer of 1942, with British forces holding the northern tip of the island while Vichy authorities continued administering everything else, all while both sides waited to see whether a wider settlement might be reached. It wasn't. By September 1942, with the strategic picture in the Pacific and Indian Ocean having stabilized somewhat, reducing the immediate Japanese threat that had justified the whole operation in the first place, though British planners were also increasingly concerned that a prolonged, unresolved occupation looked politically messy and militarily untidy, Britain decided to finish what it had started. A second wave of landings, this time aimed at the port of Majunga on the island's west coast, began in September 1942, opening a fresh advance toward the Vichy administrative capital. This second phase of the campaign turned out to be, in some ways, a more serious military undertaking than the initial lightning strike at Diego Suarez. British and Empire forces, reinforced with South African armored car units and additional infantry, had to fight their way across considerable distances of Madagascar's interior, contending with difficult terrain, tropical conditions, and a Vichy defense that fought a fighting retreat rather than folding immediately. Fighting continued through October and into early November 1942, with British forces gradually pushing Vichy defenders back toward the island's eastern regions. Finally, on November 5, 1942, 6 full months after the initial landings at Diego Suarez, Governor-General Annette formally surrendered the remainder of Madagascar to British forces. The campaign that had been expected to be a quick, surgical strike to deny Japan a potential naval base had instead stretched across half a year of intermittent fighting across an island roughly 1,600 kilometers. Part 6. The Strange Diplomatic Aftermath. What happened after the conquest is almost as strange as the invasion itself. Britain did not annex Madagascar or fold it into its own colonial empire. Instead, administrative control was gradually transferred to the Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle, the very movement that Vichy loyalists on the island had been resisting the whole time. This handover, however, was neither immediate nor entirely smooth. British forces initially retained military control of the island for some time after the surrender, and de Gaulle's Free French movement, still smarting from years of being treated as a junior, sometimes barely tolerated partner by Britain and the United States, resented that Britain had conquered French territory and then took months to hand it over to French administration, rather than involving Free French forces directly in the original invasion. It was a small but telling episode in the much larger, often prickly relationship between Britain and de Gaulle throughout the war. A relationship defined by mutual dependence and mutual irritation in roughly equal measure. For the Vichy French troops captured during the campaign, an unusual choice was extended. Many were given the option to join Free French forces and continue fighting against Germany, effectively switching sides in the same war they had just been fighting on the other end of. Some took this option. Others, more loyal to Pétain's government or simply exhausted by the whole ordeal, did not, and ended up interned or repatriated instead. For the Malagasy population itself, the people whose island this actually was, and whose voice is almost entirely absent from every account of this campaign written from either the British or French perspective, the war changed remarkably little in any immediate sense. Colonial administration simply passed from one set of French administrators aligned with Vichy to another set of French administrators aligned with de Gaulle. It would be another 18 years until 1960 before Madagascar achieved actual independence from France altogether. The 1942 campaign, whatever its strategic logic for the distant war being fought thousands of miles away, changed essentially nothing about the colonial reality Malagasy people lived under. It's worth noting, too, that this pattern, one colonial power seizing territory from another colonial power, with the actual colonized population having no say whatsoever in the matter, became something of a recurring footnote throughout the war's colonial theaters, from Madagascar to French Indochina to the various colonial possessions fought over across Africa and the Pacific. The rhetoric of the war being fought for freedom sat uneasily alongside episodes like this one. There is also a quieter irony worth sitting with here. Free France itself, the movement that would eventually inherit Madagascar and go on to sit at the table among the victorious Allied powers, was every bit as committed to maintaining French colonial rule as Vichy had been.
De Gaulle's wartime rhetoric spoke passionately about liberty and resistance to tyranny, but that rhetoric was consistently understood by de Gaulle and by virtually every French political figure of the era, regardless of their stance on Vichy or collaboration, to apply to metropolitan France itself, not to the millions of colonial subjects across France's overseas empire. Madagascar's transfer from Vichy to Free French hands in late 1942 changed the flag and the paperwork. It did not meaningfully change the lived experience of the Malagasy people, who would go on to stage their own bloody uprising against continued French rule in 1947. A rebellion violently suppressed with a death toll estimated in the tens of thousands, a grim postscript that rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as the liberation narrative surrounding the 1942 campaign.
Part 7.5: The Men and the Machines Behind the Operation. Before turning to the final verdict on Ironclad, it's worth pausing on some of the individual details that made this campaign distinct, because for an operation so rarely discussed, it involved a genuinely unusual cast of characters and equipment. Command of the operation fell to Rear Admiral Edward Neville Seifert for the naval component, with Major General Robert Sturgis leading the ground forces, Sturgis being a Royal Marine officer who would go on, later in the war, to command British commando forces during the Normandy campaign. The choice to lead with Royal Marines and commando units for the initial Diego Suarez landing reflected lessons Britain was still very much learning about amphibious warfare at this stage of the conflict. Ironclad predates the more famous commando raids on Dieppe and Saint-Nazaire and predates the North African landings of Operation Torch by 6 months, making it one of the earliest tests of techniques that would later be refined for Normandy itself. The aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious deserves special attention, since its involvement ties Madagascar to one of the more famous episodes of the naval war. Illustrious had already earned fame and taken serious damage during the Mediterranean campaign, including a devastating dive bomber attack by German Stuka pilots off Malta in early 1941 that nearly sank her outright. By the time she arrived off Madagascar barely a year later, freshly repaired, she represented a substantial commitment of one of Britain's most valuable and hard-won naval assets to what was, on the surface, a fairly obscure colonial skirmish, underscoring just how seriously London took the Indian Ocean threat at the time. On the Vichy side, the defenders included units of the Foreign Legion, colonial infantry, and a small but determined contingent of Malagasy troops serving under French officers. Troops who, whatever their personal views on the political dispute between Vichy and Free France, found themselves fighting and dying to defend a colonial administration that offered them no meaningful stake in its outcome either way. Vichy naval forces at Diego Suarez included a handful of submarines, one of which, the Bevizier, managed to torpedo and damage the battleship HMS Ramillies during the operation. A reminder that even a heavily outmatched Vichy garrison retained the capacity to inflict real damage on a numerically and technologically superior opponent. The South African contribution to the second phase of the campaign, the push toward Tananarive in the autumn of 1942, is also frequently overlooked. South African armored car units played a significant role in the advance across the island's interior, reflecting how thoroughly this was an empire-wide undertaking rather than a purely British one, a pattern that held true across most of Britain's wartime campaigns but rarely gets acknowledged when these operations are summarized for popular audiences. Part 8. Did it actually matter? The strategic verdict. Here's an uncomfortable question worth asking directly. Was Operation Ironclad even necessary? In hindsight, the Japanese threat that justified the entire operation turned out to be considerably smaller than British planners feared in the anxious spring of 1942.
Japan's Indian Ocean raid in April 1942 was a hit-and-run operation, not the opening move of a sustained westward campaign. Japanese naval strategy was in fact already pivoting toward the decisive confrontation with the United States that would culminate at Midway just weeks after Madagascar's second phase of fighting was still ongoing. There's no strong historical evidence that Japan ever seriously planned to establish a permanent base in Madagascar, and Vichy authorities, whatever their political alignment with the armistice terms Germany had imposed, gave no clear indication that they intended to actively invite Japanese forces onto the island the Vichy administrators in Indochina had. Some historians argue that Ironclad was, in this sense, a classic case of preemptive action against a threat that never fully materialized, not unlike other decisions made in the fog of a global war where intelligence was imperfect and the cost of guessing wrong seemed catastrophically high. Others push back on this framing, pointing out that the precedent set in Indochina made the fear entirely reasonable at the time the decision was made, and judging the decision by outcomes we only know in hindsight isn't fair to the planners who had to act on the information available to them in early 1942, when the war looked, from London's perspective, close to being lost across the entire Indian Ocean theater. What's less disputed is the human and political cost of the operation. Dozens of soldiers died on both sides in a fight between two nations that were not, in any conventional sense, actually at war with one another. Britain and Vichy France never exchanged formal declarations of war, existing instead in this strange gray zone of hostile neutrality, punctuated by episodes like Mers el-Kebir, Madagascar, and later Allied landings in North Africa. It strained relations with the Free French movement at a moment when Allied unity mattered enormously, and it tied up a not insignificant force of troops, ships, and aircraft for the better part of a year, at a time when Britain was fighting for its life in North Africa and struggling to keep the Atlantic sea lanes open against German U-boats.
Part 9. Why this campaign deserves to be remembered. Operation Ironclad rarely appears in mainstream popular accounts of the Second World War, and it's worth thinking about why. It doesn't fit neatly into the familiar narrative of Allies versus Axis. The enemy here was, awkwardly, a fragment of a nation that would later be celebrated as one of the Allies' own, once de Gaulle's Free French forces took their place among the victorious powers at war's end. It lacks the scale and drama of the war's headline battles, and it raises uncomfortable questions about colonial power, preemptive war, and the treatment of a supposedly liberated population that continued living under the exact same colonial system regardless of which European flag happened to be flying over it. But precisely because of those complications, Madagascar tells us something important about how the Second World War actually worked at ground level, far from the simplified morality of the newsreels. It was a war shaped as much by fear of what might happen as by what actually did happen. It was a war where former allies became targets, where colonial populations remained voiceless bystanders regardless of who won, and where the biggest naval and amphibious operation Britain had mounted up to that point in the entire war was fought not against Hitler's Germany or Hirohito's Japan, but against fellow Frenchmen defending an island most people, then and now, would struggle to find on a map. It's a reminder that the Second World War wasn't one clean story. It was hundreds of smaller, messier, morally complicated stories happening simultaneously across every ocean and continent on Earth. And Madagascar, in May and again in September of 1942, was one of the strangest and most overlooked of them all.